Hey, Dr. Seegren here, bringing you another YouTube lecture, and we're going to continue talking about the Earth and the different processes that shape the Earth and what's really been going on Earth for the last 4.5 billion years. And last class we talked a little bit about rocks, and we mentioned things like volcanoes and some of the different things that shape rocks, like heat and pressure, and we'll continue that theme today with our discussion of plate tectonics. And that might be a term that you're familiar with from middle school, and I'll go over what it means if you haven't ever heard of it. But essentially, we want to know what is plate tectonics, how did we discover it, so what is the science behind this theory, the evidence for it, and we want to know how it works. So basically, what causes plate tectonics to actually happen in the world, and lastly, how does it shape our planet and also the rocks on the planet. So we will talk about all those things in this lecture, so let's get right into it. So again, you've probably heard of plate tectonics, but what exactly is plate tectonics? Simply, it's the idea that the Earth's crust, which is kind of the outer layer of the Earth, is made of separate plates, and these plates are moving around slowly over time. And this little diagram on the right can help show it. The idea is that if you could peel back the outer layer of the Earth, like it was an onion or an orange, inside we would have lava and magma. And on the outside, this peel, this crust, is actually made of separate plates. And that these plates could be actually moving in different directions at different times. That's the idea of plate tectonics. Another way to visualize this is actually if you look at the surface of lava in a volcano, sometimes a similar effect will take place. So this is a time-lapse video, and you can see that as the fresh lava is coming to the surface, it will kind of harden and create this crust. And the crust, as the lava underneath it is moving, is shifting around. Sometimes these different pieces are colliding into each other. And this is pretty much what's going on the Earth, but just at a much, much bigger scale. All right, so when we're talking about the evidence of plate tectonics, actually it's one of the most compelling pieces of evidence is just looking at a map of the Earth. And one of the patterns that you kind of notice is that one right off the bat that you kind of notice is that the sort of groove in Africa is shaped very similarly to the kind of outer side of South America. And it's almost like this fit into there at some point in time. And actually, if you follow the entire outline of North and South America and the outline of Europe and Africa, it kind of fits the same shape. You can almost see where it all would just kind of fit together like it's been separated. And additionally, if you know what the bottom of the ocean looks like, there is actually like a little bit of a mountain range right in the middle of this as well. So you have this very distinct pattern where all of these continents kind of fit together, and in the between them is an ocean which also has a similar pattern to it. And so right away, the idea that maybe these continents were once together is pretty compelling just looking at a map. Basically, this is what the early scientists that came up with this idea were looking at. Basically, South America and Africa do really fit together very nicely. And the guy who came up with this, his name was ALFRED Wegener. He was a German scientist, and he proposed this theory in 1912. It's kind of interesting to think about. That might seem late to you. It certainly seems late to me. I mean, 1912 was, after all, we're already to World War I. We have a lot of technology at the time. You know, how is it that we didn't know about continental drift and plate tectonics until only, about 100 years ago? And it wasn't even fully accepted until the 1950s. So it was still a hypothesis until the 1950s, this whole idea that I'm explaining to you today. That's really not that long ago. I mean, shortly after we had the idea of plate tectonics and we accepted it as being true, we were putting people on the moon not too far behind it. It seems a bit backwards that that's how long it took to figure this out. And the reason for that is that it is a pretty crazy puzzle to put together, and it actually took a lot of evidence to do so. Something else that played a factor is that we kind of take for granted that pattern that I just showed you on the map. We take for granted that we know what a world map looks like. This is a map that was drawn from the 1600s, and it kind of has everything on the world put together, but you can see that all the shapes are pretty distorted. People, as they were traveling around the world, they were trying to figure out where land was and where they were, but the only way to figure out where they were was by looking at the stars or the sun or the moon and kind of trying to approximate exactly where they were on the planet. And, this got better and better over time, but it took us a long time before we even knew really what the world looked like. And in terms of knowing what the bottom of the ocean looked like, we didn't know that until after World War II and the development of sonar. So when we think about a theory that involves something as big as the Earth, I think we maybe take for granted how much we know in the modern world and how much really wasn't known about anything 100 or 200 years ago. But some of the evidence that he was looking at was based off of fossils. So when you look at fossils on different continents, for example, if you look at fossils on India here and Africa, we see that there are some of the same types of fossils that we find. For example, a reptile by the name of Listersaurus. And this was not a reptile that was swimming, so this was a land reptile, and so it was living on the land. And we find it in part of Africa, but not all of Africa. We find it in part of India, not all of India, and we find it even in parts of Antarctica. So if we look at a modern day map of this creature's range where it lived, we would see fossils here in India, and fossils down in Antarctica. And what Wegener was wondering is why would you find this animal here, and way down in Antarctica where the climate is not suitable for a reptile at all, and you wouldn't see it in between these areas in here. So the idea that somehow it was like swimming back and forth to these areas doesn't really make sense. How is this possible that you would get this pattern of fossils? And the idea is that it's impossible without the continents being together at one point. And so the idea is that there used to be a supercontinent that composed of South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia, and you see fossils that are similar across this range. And later on, these continents separated. The fossils obviously stayed with the continents, and now we are digging them up, and their location doesn't really make sense unless we assume that the continents were together at one point. Something else that's pretty compelling is that there is evidence of glaciers. So pretty much everywhere in this little white area here on the map, there's evidence of glaciers. And if you don't know what a glacier is, it's a big sheet of ice, and it will leave markings on rocks and certain patterns of rocks. So we find glaciers up here, evidence of glaciers, not currently, but we find evidence of glaciers up here in the Congo. And if we look at where the Congo is today in Africa, once again, what we see is that this is one of the densest tropical rainforests on planet Earth, and it's one of the warmest places on planet Earth. And there is no way that where it is currently there would ever be a glacier there. There's no way there would ever be ice that would be freezing in the middle of a tropical rainforest. And we don't see evidence of glaciers in certain areas, like in northern Africa. Here, there's no evidence of glaciers. And the idea is that we think that Africa used to be down here and has been moving up this way. And so this southern area of Africa used to be down far enough south near Antarctica that ice would have been able to form, and ice sheets and glaciers would have been able to form. All right, so Alfred Wegener got us pretty far along with the evidence that he collected in terms of suggesting that the continents were moving, and he called this this notion continental drift. But he didn't really know how it was happening, and there were still actually a lot of people that weren't convinced by this because it just sounded kind of like a crazy idea that right now you and I and everybody is moving along with the entire United States. We're all just shifting around. That just sounds kind of crazy, but it happens to be true. So we had some additional advancements for the theory of plate tectonics. One was made by Arthur Holmes, who was an early supporter of this idea, and he suggested that basically something called magma convection would be what was moving the plates. And convection is a word that we will be coming across many times in this class, and so it's good to get an early start on defining it. Convection is basically a circular motion made in a fluid based off of heat. And so the idea with convection is that if you have a heat source, like the center of the Earth, which is really, really hot, and there are even some nuclear reactions that are keeping it hot over time. We don't need to go into that, but it's basically really, really hot in the center of the Earth. You may have heard the kind of expression that heat rises. And over here, up on the top of the Earth, it's cooler out here. And you might have also heard the expression that cold sinks. So colder things tend to sink, and the idea is that when you combine these two, the tendency of heat to rise and cold things to sink, you get like a loop or a current. This is the same thing that drives the ocean currents as well as wind on Earth. It fuels hurricanes and tornadoes. It's all convection. The idea that heat rises and cold sinks and kind of makes a loop in the process. And so this is what we think is happening in the Earth. If you didn't already know, we say the Earth has a few different layers to it. The outside layer we call the crust. The next layer we call the mantle, and then the inner layer we call the core. And technically there's an inner and outer core, but we won't get into that for this. And in the mantle is where we think convection is going on. So down underneath the crust, which is cooler and hardened into rock, that's what you and I are standing on right now. If you were to drill down deep, deep, deep into below you right now, eventually you would hit lava or magma. And this magma is probably moving because of convection. So anywhere that's hot will be rising to the surface. The magma will be rising to the surface and pushing to the surface. Any area of the magma, the lava that's a little bit cooler, will be sinking back down towards the core. And this movement would also happen to carry the pieces of the crust along with it. And so that was all come up with by Arthur Holmes. Harry Hess, another scientist, came up with the idea that the seafloor might be spreading, and this was an idea that was formulated after the invention of sonar in World War II, when we first could map the bottom of the ocean. And so up until the 1940s and 50s, we had no idea how deep parts of the ocean were because we didn't have the technology to see down there. In some places, you're talking miles and miles and miles deep. The only way you can really measure that is if you drop like an anchor, and in some places where it's 5 miles deep, there's no way you could drop a 5-mile anchor down there. So we didn't know how deep a huge chunk of the ocean was back in the day, and it was only really in the 40s and 50s that we invented a way to use sound waves to measure how deep water was. And what we found actually was that the ocean floor was not flat, but actually that on the bottom of the ocean you have actual mountain ranges and trenches and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And that was when we first saw that there was this thing that we call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge right here that goes all the way from the North Pole down to the South Pole almost, and separates South America and Africa, North America and Europe. And in the middle, there's kind of like a mountain range in the entirety of the middle. And what Hess was looking at was, okay, so Holmes came up with this idea of convection, and what he came up with was the idea that if you had two convection loops kind of moving in opposite directions, like we have here, you would have a space in the center where new lava would come up and kind of push to the surface, and in the process would kind of bulge up and create a little mountain range of new rock. And he said that this ridge here was such a mountain range. So this mountain range in the middle of the ocean underwater would be where lava from underneath the earth is pushing up to the surface and forming new rocks right there at the bottom of the ocean. And he said this would be called seafloor spreading. And basically in the modern day, we've in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've been able to confirm all these ideas. We've used that principle of radioactive decay, which is how we figured out how old the fossils were. We can also do the same kind of analysis on the rocks at the bottom of the ocean. And actually, even now, we can even use satellites to figure out how fast each continent is moving. So, for example, if we fast forward a year, and if we were holding a high-tech GPS device where we were and we just stayed put for a year, we would have moved here in North America about 2 inches to the west compared to Europe. And we can actually measure that with satellites. So it is definitely, we're moving very slowly. So we can confirm all that. But the radioactive decay measurements of the ocean floor showed basically that exactly what Hess and Holmes thought. The rock in the very center of this Atlantic Ocean ridge is young. It's fresh rock. It's brand new rock. And that's evidence that basically magma is pushing up in the center and creating more rock. And that's what's causing these continents to drift out. So basically, as the lava is pushing up in the center, it's forcing these plates that is holding the continents to move over time. And so we have new rock in the center, and the oldest rock in the ocean is out here on the outside, in the blues and greens here. So all that is old rock, and that's what you would expect if this was actually happening. So all this evidence, we call plate tectonics a theory. We say it's a theory of plate tectonics. It's not a hypothesis, because there is so much evidence in support of it that we are about as confident that it is true as we are of anything in science. So we are very, very confident that this is real and is actually happening. All right, so that kind of walks you through the history of plate tectonics, how we figured it out, and the evidence of why we think it's happening. And I'm sure if you're being reasonable, you are convinced as well that this is real and actually happening. So now we're going to go into more about, so what? So why do we care? How does this impact the world? All that stuff. And to do that, we have to set up a few details about the interactions of these plates. And the first detail of this is that the plates on the surface that make up the Earth's crust there's actually two types of this crust. And here in the picture, we can see that in the ocean, even though you have water, if you go down to the bottom of the ocean, you will hit rock eventually, right? And then if you keep going down, eventually you're going to hit magma. And that's the mantle down there. Magma. So the continental crust we can see is where the land is, and that crust is considerably thicker than the ocean crust. So in the bottom of the ocean, the rock down there is very thin compared to the continental crust. And something else about these two, the continental crust, just to tie it into the rock lesson, is made of granite primarily, that rock I showed you in the last class. And the crust in the ocean is mainly made of basalt, which was that black rock that I showed you in the last class, and said it was probably the most common rock on planet Earth because it's down there beneath all the oceans. Granite was kind of the pinkish one that had the big crystals in it. So basalt and granite. And the thing about granite is that it is actually a lighter rock. It is less heavy or less dense. And so it tends to float on top of the basalt, which is more dense and heavier. It also happens to be thinner. So this is just to set up basically everything that's about to follow, in that the continental crust, where the land is thicker and less dense and will actually float on top of the oceanic crust when the two meet together. So like right here, you can see the continental crust is actually on top of the oceanic crust. All right, pretty good so far. Let's keep going. All right, so the other thing about this plate tectonic stuff is that as these plates are moving, anywhere, if you're a big giant landmass or a big chunk of rock underneath the ocean and you're moving, anywhere that you're moving is going to be occupied space, right? So something else is going to be there. There's no portion of the earth that's not covered in rock. And so when plates are moving and they happen to be moving into another rock or crashing into another plate, we call that a convergent boundary. So when two things are converging, they're coming together. And so if you have two slabs of rock, two plates that are moving, and they're moving in such a way that they are actually moving into each other and running into each other, we call that a convergent boundary. And similarly, when they are moving apart from one another, we call that a divergent boundary. And we can kind of imagine what this looks like with our hands. If my hands are plates and the lava underneath is moving and is pushing my hand, they can push together, or the lava can be pushing them apart. That's generally the general pattern, those two options. We'll go over a third one. Technically, the lava can be moving in such a way that they're not really moving together or apart, but rather are kind of sliding along each other. So kind of like this. So rather than running in or separating, they're actually sliding past each other. And so those are the main interactions that we can imagine are going to be happening on Earth. And you can pretty much already kind of see what would happen if you move them apart. We've already told what would happen. If we have, these are chunks of rock and underneath here is lava. If you move them apart, lava is going to come to the surface and you're going to have volcanoes or new rocks forming as that lava cools in the middle. Okay, if they're crashing into each other, well, they don't really have anywhere to go, so they're just going to crumble and crunch together, right? That's going to be a mountain, as we see. So that's just kind of a way to visualize these things that we're going to be talking about. So let's go over that first type of boundary, where we have two crusts that are moving apart. Now, something that I didn't bring up yet is that we could have two continents that are continent plates that are moving apart, right? We have continent crusts, we have continent plates, or we could have two ocean plates moving apart, or we could have a combination of the two. And we're really just going to focus on the ocean and continent interactions right now. So if you have two ocean crusts moving apart, so this is what this diagram is showing you. So here is the lava, magma down here. And it's moving in such a way that basically it's pushing these plates apart and it's coming to the surface here in the middle. We call that a divergent ocean boundary. And what this does is that as this magma is coming up and pushing to the surface and kind of pushing out on these plates, the plates move this way and this way. And in the middle here, we have new rock. Because basically the lava is coming up And most of the time, before it even makes it to the water, it's cooling down and turning into rock. And so that is going to form new rock there in the very center of this. And because it's kind of pushing up, it also creates what we call a ridge. So a mid-ocean ridge is kind of like it's not quite a mountain underneath the ocean, but it is kind of mountain shaped in terms of it's a part of the ocean that is a little bit shallower than other parts. So anywhere in the ocean where you see these ridges, that is a new rock forming from a divergent boundary. So what does this look like? Well, like I was saying, the most prominent one is right here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it doesn't look like a whole lot of anything because it's at the bottom of the ocean. If you took a submarine down there, you would see a lot of volcanic activity. So if you've ever heard of hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, where all these kind of crazy creatures live along these volcanic vents, you would find a lot of those there. And there's really only one place in the world where there is an island called Iceland that's kind of in the middle of this ocean split. And that creates a kind of some unique looking volcanoes there in the island of Iceland. And I'll show you what those look like. And yeah, in that video, you can almost see this volcano with the magma pushing up forcefully right here in the center. You can actually kind of see these layers of the earth, the crust, kind of buckling back as this magma is pushing in the center and kind of peeling back, sort of like that, just like I was talking about would happen with this divergent boundary. So Iceland is an excellent example of a divergent boundary. All right, so what happens when a divergent boundary happens with a continent? So imagine you have a continental plate, a big hunk of rock and crust that's very thick, and then the lava underneath begins moving much in the same way, kind of starts doing this to this crust, moving this one this way and the other one this way. Well, there might be a little bit of lava trying to work its way up, but this crust, remember, is really, really thick, and so it won't come to the surface, not for quite some time. And so what is created is what we call a rift valley. So a rift valley forms when you have two continents, two slabs of continental crust that are moving apart from each other. And eventually, this will just result in a new ocean. So eventually, as this valley gets bigger and bigger and begins crumbling more and more, water is going to come in the side at some point. It's going to meet the ocean. Salt water is going to rush in, fill in the gap of this valley, kill any of the plants and animals that were living there slowly over time, and basically just turn into a new ocean. And then once you have an ocean in there, then the lava is coming up and it's basically just going to start. This basically is going to just be like the last ocean separation, ocean divergent boundary. So that is what is happening with a continental split. And one of the places that we can see this happening is Africa, actually. The eastern side of Africa has a boundary, and it's actually pretty neat because, well, you can kind of see it actually kind of splits in half at one point, and basically there is a tendency for this pulling in multiple directions going on in Africa. And this has already resulted in the very shallow Red Sea that's opened up here in the Gulf of Aden. So you can see this very shallow ocean has opened up. These two continents, the Arab Peninsula and Africa, used to be merged, and as they pulled apart more and more, eventually the ocean just kind of rushed in and filled this gap. And that's what those seas are. In parts of Africa where it's still ripping open, we are still seeing this rift valley. And you can't really see it. It's so big, you're talking miles upon miles wide, that you don't really see any kind of like canyon. You will see occasionally things like these weird volcanic sinkholes can begin opening them up. And you can also see this tendency in Victoria Falls. So the cracks that you were seeing in those videos, some of those were just canyons, but some of it is the process. Victoria Falls isn't right on the Rift Valley, but it's on those plates that are moving. And sometimes as these plates are shifting apart, lava's coming up, there's some shifting of the continents themselves, and we call that uplift. So parts of Africa are getting shoved up and out as they're being pushed. And if you have a river that's in the process that's trying to flow, and then the continent is getting pushed up into the river, it ends up creating a situation sometimes where you can get these crazy waterfalls where the continent is pushing up and cracking in such a way that the river has nowhere to go except over the falls. That's kind of the idea with that, Victoria Falls. All right, so now I'm going to move on to convergent boundaries. You might be asking, well, we did what happens when two oceans split apart, and we did what happens when two continents split apart, but what about when a continent and an ocean split apart? That pretty much just forms the same idea as the ocean-ocean boundary, where the ocean and the continent are splitting apart in the middle, you get fresh lava, and you might have a ridge kind of situation slowly forming. So it's usually not one that people diagram out, and it's also not very common on the planet Earth. So moving on to convergent boundaries, we're going to talk about what happens when two continents slam into each other, and we're also going to talk about what happens when an ocean plate hits a continent plate. Now, remember, I mentioned that the continental plate is less heavy and will float up a little bit higher than the ocean plate. And the ocean plate is very thin and is generally heavier and sinks down more. So the tendency is that when an ocean plate runs into a continent plate, it will tend to go underneath it like this. And we call that subduction. And here's our diagram for that. So we say the ocean plate subducts or sinks. Subduction and subduct are just a fancy word for going underneath or sinking. And so here is our ocean plate here, and here is our continental plate or our land plate. And basically, when the ocean plate runs into this big, giant, thick land plate and it's heavier, it just kind of tends to push underneath it, subduct. And the mountain plate kind of goes over the top of it. Now, right where they meet here, there is some tendency of a crunch, and that is why you do get usually some mountains forming here, because this land plate is getting crunched a bit against this ocean plate. And as this ocean plate is getting forced underneath, you will have a very deep part of the ocean right where these meet. And this is a trench. So all the really, really deep areas of the ocean, that's what's happening. We have an ocean plate running into a land plate. And something else that you see at this boundary is that all this rock, so we talked about where new rock is born. This is basically where old rock typically goes to die. So if you're an old ocean rock, chances are you've made it maybe millions of years, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, and have slowly been cruising, and then, now you've run into a mountain, you're getting pushed back down underneath the earth, and you are melting. So the ocean rock will melt as it gets pushed deeper and deeper into the earth down here. And as it's melting, remember, this was at the bottom of the ocean. There's some water pockets that are trapped in it. there's all these gases, and all this melting rock is bubbling and causing all this bubbling here and burning a hole usually in the land, and will come up as a volcano sometimes. So that is basically what's happening, and this is a super important boundary, and it's very common on Earth. And basically, this is where we get what we call volcanic arc mountains. So we'll have a mountain range that also has little volcanoes randomly checkered throughout it. And so these are continental volcanoes that form as a result of the ocean-continent convergence. And to tie it into our last class, rhyolite, that rock that I talked about, which was an extrusive igneous rock, extrusive meaning that it forms at the Earth's surface. Well, we get rhyolite a lot in these mountain ranges because lava is shooting out and cooling pretty quickly and turning into rhyolite. Obsidian you also find here as well. And we call it an arc because oftentimes on the edge of a plate, it kind of forms a circular pattern. And so, for example, this is a map of all the volcanoes on Earth, and you can see this big ocean plate here is moving this way and crashing into our lovely United States, and in the process it's pushing underneath it and creating this chain of volcanoes that runs all the way down. And we actually call this massive chain. On this side it's moving this way and going underneath Asia and all these islands, and we see all these arcs and chains, and we call this massive ring here the ring of fire on Earth, because that's the interaction that we're seeing here. So typically volcanoes are the most common on this type of plate boundary. And our next type of plate boundary is the continent-to-continent conversion. That's when two pieces of land slam into each other. And when this happens, remember these are both pretty thick, light pieces of crust already, and neither one really sinks underneath the other one. Instead, they just kind of crash together and create this massive bulge, and that's what we call mountains. So basically, when continents collide, they produce mountains. Eventually, if enough of them shove into each other, you might get some of it going, pushing way deep and melting. So some of this rock down here might be beginning to melt. And we talked the last class about metamorphic rocks, where you need a lot of heat and pressure. And so down here, where these mountains are crashing together and generating heat and getting pushed down into closer to the magma, that is where you're going to get metamorphic rocks forming in here. Kind of in this zone is going to be metamorphic rock zone. And occasionally some of these will end up getting pushed and pushed up to the surface or eroded down, and eventually we get to find them. But that's why metamorphic rocks are a little bit rare. They only form under certain circumstances. And briefly, we will talk also about transform faults. So there are occasions where you will get plate motion, like in California, where one plate is moving one direction and the other is moving this way. So now we're looking kind of top down on this, like a map. Instead of looking at the cross section, we're looking top down, and that means that these plates aren't really running into each other or separating out, they're just sliding past each other, and that's called a transform fault. So plate motion is neither convergent or divergent. An example of this obviously is California, and what you get when this happens, more often than not, you get earthquakes. And you can kind of imagine why. Technically, all of these boundaries can produce earthquakes, but when you're sliding across and sliding like this, you kind of feel like there's so much friction there that you get these shifts that are very violent when pressure builds up, and that's what an earthquake is. So if you didn't know, that's what causes earthquakes in the world, and this is one of the main reasons that plate tectonics is such an important field of study, is to learn when earthquakes, when pressure is building up in these plates, and being able to predict when earthquakes might happen. So pressure builds up, and basically powerful sound and fluid waves are released when the rocks slide past each other. And so that might have been what happened here, right? This guy right here in the picture is probably standing between two plates. So this is probably one plate that was maybe moving that way, and this plate was moving this way. And then when they slid, this poor road was right in the middle of it, and it all crumbled, basically, when it eventually broke free and was allowed to move. That brings us up to our kind of last and final question is how many plates actually are there on Earth? Is it just one per continent? How does this actually work? And the best way to kind of look at this and measure it is figuring out where the earthquakes on Earth are. And pretty much wherever you have patterns of earthquakes will outline the plate boundaries. Pretty much all of these plate boundaries will have earthquakes. The transform boundaries have more of them, but all of them will generate it. And you can see pretty clearly how many plates you have. Some plates are big, some plates are small, but pretty much everywhere you see a little loop that is contained in earthquakes, like this would be a plate, and this would be a plate, and this would be a plate, and this would be a plate down here, etc., are the plates of the Earth. And in total, we say there's actually 7 major plates and 8 minor ones, so 15 total plates on Earth, all moving around different directions, causing chaos, creating volcanoes, valleys, mountains, earthquakes, you name it. So that, I think, gives you a pretty good overview of this subject. Plate tectonics is really, really important in the world. Where we are in Texas, you'll notice on this map that we don't really have many earthquakes. We really don't have anything going on here. That's because if the plate is here, we're kind of in the center of the plate, far enough away from the edge to be spared any kind of crazy volcanoes or earthquakes. So yeah, as like a Texan, you might not think tectonic plates are all that important, but for a lot of people in the world, they are really important, and they shape a lot of their lives. So hopefully you learned something, and that'll be it for today. Hope you have a great day.